Allow me to introduce myself.
I am the last sane sports fan.
I am a genius by trade.
I just knew too much. Does that make me crazy? Does that make me crazy? Does that make me crazy? Possibly.
Hello everyone and welcome once again to The View from the Midwest. There's a few hot topics going on around in the world of sports, so let's get right to them. We'll start off with the major things that happened over the last couple days. The championships have all been decided, and congratulations to the winners, the Chicago Blackhawks in the NHL and the Golden State Warriors in the NBA. Now, regardless of how you feel about any of those teams, whether you like them, whether you hate them, whether you were for LeBron, whether you were just against the Chicago Blackhawks, whether you were a Tampa fan, whether you were a St. Louis kind of connection, rooting for John Cooper and Ben Bishop and all that. And regardless of how you feel, you do have to admit that even the most hated of the Blackhawks, they deserved to be champions. The Golden State Warriors, they came out, they did their job, they were facing a lesser team than they could have been. Kyrie Irving was hurt. There was no Kevin Love. It was basically LeBron James and a bunch of role players. But Golden State did what they needed to do. They slipped up a few games and ultimately didn't get a sweep, didn't close out the series quite as quickly as maybe a lot of people believe they should have. But they're NBA champions, and you can't take that away from them. Now, a point was brought up yesterday. It's whether or not they are one of the greatest teams of all time. I don't think you can go as far as that. They are a great team. They went through a very difficult Western Conference. They have the sixth best winning record of all time in the NBA. But again, they faced a tough path going to the NBA Finals, and they faced a tough test in LeBron James at perhaps the peak of his basketball prowess. But I just don't think, unless you do it again and again, like the Spurs have done, like even the Rockets did, winning a couple championships in the 90s, obviously what the Bulls did, what the Lakers did, what the Celtics have done, winning multiple championships, then I don't necessarily know that you can consider yourselves one of the greatest teams of all time, simply because teams that only win it once and then kind of disappear aren't necessarily remembered. For good or bad, that's just kind of the way that it happens. Now, to another point that was kind of brought up, that the Warriors should almost feel embarrassed that they didn't get a sweep. To me, that's taking away a lot of credit from LeBron James. I saw a fairly prominent person on Facebook commenting a couple times that Golden State should have easily swept this one simply because LeBron James was by himself. Well, yes, LeBron James was by himself, but if nothing else, that goes to prove how good the player actually is, regardless of where you want to rank him in terms of all-time history. To lead a team twice to the NBA Finals with very little in the way of supporting cast, that does go to show how good of a player LeBron James is. And the NBA is such that when a team goes cold the way that Golden State did in their losses, they're a three-point shooting team. Eventually you're going to start missing them. LeBron James took advantage of that and willed his team to victory. The greats do that. They can do that. They can win you a game or two. They're not necessarily going to be able to win a series because it's so hard to sustain when you're playing against a full team. So the idea that they should have swept is quite frankly ridiculous. It would not have surprised me had it happened, but LeBron James is so good that I did not expect it to happen. It did not happen, but ultimately the result that most of us expected, given the lineups, did end up happening with the Golden State Warriors winning. On the ice, it was the Chicago Blackhawks winning for their third cup in about 6 years, and they're probably as close to a dynasty as them and the LA Kings the past 6 years or so, or probably about as close to an NHL dynasty as you're ever going to see. Obviously, leaving out the Islanders of the '80s and maybe even the Detroit Red Wings in the 90s just because they were so good. They didn't necessarily win the amount of cups that you would think they win. It seemed like they were winning all the time. When you go back and look at how many they won, it wasn't as many as one would expect. But still, the Red Wings have to be included in that in the 90s and early 2000s. But Chicago is one of those teams that they find a way to kind of recycle. They find a way to come back, and they're going to have to do it again in a couple years. Whether or not they have a great record next year is still to be seen. When you have that core of Taves and Kane, and obviously Hossa is still up there in terms of talent. He's getting up in age and everything, but he's still a good player. But rumors are right now that due to the cap position that the Chicago Blackhawks may be in, that they are going to be forced to trade Patrick Sharp. But when you can afford to get rid of players like Dustin Byfuglien and some of the other players that the Chicago Blackhawks have lost over the years and still turn it around and be one of the best teams in the toughest conference in hockey, in the toughest division in hockey. Now, they're not always necessarily winning, but they are winning in the playoffs, and that's ultimately where it matters. So Chicago is really still set up for a couple more runs at this Stanley Cup. Hopefully they don't make it that far from a personal standpoint, but from an NHL standpoint, they play a good brand of hockey. You do have to give them credit for that. Now, that is hard for me to admit, but they play a solid offensive style, but they don't allow a whole lot defensively. Duncan Keith is really proving himself to be one of the best defensemen in the league, maybe of all time. I mean, the guy is excellent offensively, but he's stout defensively. A lot of times you kind of see players tend to side one way or the other, but he is solid on both ends, and he is really one of the cornerstones of that team, and they're going to be a team to be reckoned with. They are going to have a bit of a transition period, and the teams that are not the Chicago Blackhawks need to take advantage of that. Sometimes you get a year, maybe two, to where it takes a little while for the pieces to kind of mesh together. But once Coach Quenneville gets things rolling again, then they're going to be a team to be reckoned with again. But I really don't see a whole lot of change. I don't know what their UFA situation is, what players need to be traded, what their salary cap situation is. I do know that there's a lot of rumors that Sharp is going to be traded, so I have to figure that that is cap related. But it's going to be an interesting offseason as well. And speaking of the offseason, you know that the playoffs are over when you see the extremely silly rumors start coming out. And there was a good one that came out the other day saying that the St. Louis Blues were going to trade T.J. Oshie to the New York Rangers for Rick Nash. Now, I'm not sure who would initiate that trade. It would almost seem to be the New York Rangers, as they might want to be dumping salary. But how does it make sense for the St. Louis Blues, who are already kind of in that cap limbo, to trade $4.5 million for $7 to $7.5 million? It doesn't make any sense when you're already trying to sign your best player in Vladimir Tarasenko for $7 million or up. That's probably going to be the going rate, unless he gives the Blues some sort of hometown discount. Maybe you get less money per year, but they give him a long-term deal, like 6 to 8, maybe even 10. That would be kind of pushing it in my estimation, but you don't want to lose the caliber of this player from what he has shown you in his short stint in the NHL. But I don't know that you can afford, with the Blues situation, I don't know that you can afford to have two players making essentially $15 million or so, 14 to 16 in that range, when you've still got other players to sign. They only have 16 players under contract right now. Now, granted, they are going to bring a couple guys up from the minors, and Robert Bortuzzo is an important signing. He's expected to be back, and I don't think he'll make too much money, perhaps around the Jackman level of $3 million or so, give or take. I'm not really sure what his market value is going to be. But it's just always interesting. It's entertaining. It's a little bit frustrating from a fan's point of view if you are a fan of either of those teams or any of the teams that are mentioned in some of these off-the-wall trades. The St. Louis Blues, I mean, the casual fan, you hear Rick Nash, you see what kind of numbers he produces in the regular season, you're like, heck yeah, I'll take that deal any day. But from a financial aspect, it just cannot be done. It would be extremely hard. I guess I shouldn't say it cannot be done. If the owner is willing to put up the money and they can make it fit under the cap system, then more power to them. But I just don't see adding $3 million, maybe even more, in terms of a player that is already up in age. Granted, you know his production is going to be fairly high. It doesn't necessarily make sense from a financial aspect. That is the view from the Midwest. Congratulations as well to the U.S. Women's National Soccer team. Didn't necessarily have enough time to get to that today, but as we approach the knockout rounds, we'll talk about them a little more. They beat Nigeria 1-0, won their group. They're going to face Colombia, but they have an incredibly difficult side of the bracket. A lot of tough teams over there, but as I said, we'll talk about that a little bit later. That is the view from the Midwest. As I said, what are your views on the topics that we talked about today? Comment, rate, and subscribe on YouTube. Share it around on Facebook. Leave a comment there as well, and we'll keep this rolling. But until the next time, I'll see you then.
I remember when I lost my mind. There was something so pleasant about that place. Even your emotions have an echo in so much space. And when you're out there without care,